Out of all the countries in the world, you have less than 20 that officially claim that the USSR created the famine in the Ukraine, the Holodomor. You do not have a single Asian country, not a single Arab country, not a single African country. You have Canada, you have the United States, the same United States that supported the rise of Mussolini and Hitler, and you have Britain, who had just finished paying Mussolini the equivalency of $6,000 a week to publish his fascist newspaper. These are your bedfellows. First claims that the famine was created by the USSR was in 1933 by Nazi German newspapers, which were under the thumb of the Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels. It was then picked up by the London Daily Mail, which was owned by a rabid anti-communist and anti-Semite. It was then picked up by William Randolph Hearst, who owned the largest media company in the United States. He was pro-fascist. He met with Mussolini, he met with Hitler, and he praised them. These are the folks that you listen to. You said that my weird etymology flex about the history of the word Holodomor was used to sweep the legs out or kick the legs out from underneath people who push this myth. And you're absolutely right, because the two legs that you're standing on, one is fascist propaganda and the other is imperialist propaganda. And when the facts come, they knock your legs right out from underneath you if you're paying attention. All right, I'll bite. I don't know what you mean by support Holodomor, though. There's no supporting it. It basically comes down to that there was a famine in the USSR that many people suffered from, including Ukrainians. Then many decades later came about that word that you use, the Holodomor, that was created and popularized by Ukrainian nationalists. It's basically fascist propaganda that wanted to paint communism the same as fascism. Like you already said, all of your talking points, everything that you've said in this conversation is regurgitating fascist propaganda, fascist talking points. So, I mean, you might as well just go ahead and delete that profile picture unless you're purposely doing that ironically. Have a good one, bud. One of the most interesting things about the use of the word Holodomor to me is when anti-fascists use it. When you look at the etymology of the word itself, Holodomor, do that. Google Holodomor etymology. And when you read its first usage of the word, who do you think the Ukrainian nationalists that used it blamed the Holodomor on? Who? Some Russians? What group in particular do you think? Jewish people. Okay? That's who they blame the Holodomor on. And just like the Nazis, they blame communism also on Jewish people. So, I mean, think about that word. And did they need to create a word specifically decades after an event in order to describe an event? Have we not talked about the famine and all of that stuff already? We had. I mean, just read about, look it up. We did not need to create that word, Yes, that is what the word means. But Google it and see that the word was not in their lexicon at that time. It was not invented until many decades later, when again, it was popularized and used by Ukrainian nationalists. All right. Second, please do us a favor and explain how the USSR was fascist. It's interesting because you came on to a video where I'm doing exactly that with the word Holodomor. You cannot separate a word from its origin, from its historical and material context, which is what my video was doing, explaining. And as you know, if you studied language then you know that every word is an argument. Well, what argument is Holodomor making? It's an attack. It was created as an attack on the USSR, on communism, by nationalist Ukrainians who, like how the Nazis, after Nazi Germany was crushed, how they fled to the West and they escaped trial and got jobs. So too did the Ukrainian nationalist. This is just imperialist propaganda, the Holodomor thing. And so that's exactly what I am explaining in my video, is its historical and material basis. So please go on. I'm not saying one way or another whether or not the USSR's policies exacerbated the famine or not, but this is a reasonable position to take. You can come to this conclusion by looking at the policies of the USSR and coming, to a conclusion as to whether or not you believe they exacerbated the situation or not. Whereas with the claim that the USSR created the famine, there's not a single shred of evidence. There's not a single document that you can point to that confirms that. There's no policy. There was nothing written to prove that claim. You simply have the claim made by Nazi German papers. You have the claims backed up by imperialist papers in Britain and in the United States. But think about it. Think about what a conspiracy like that how much that would take to pull off, how you would direct a famine at a particular area in your country and at a particular group of people. There would be some sort of evidence that we could go back to, and where in policy it was put into place. I know that a lot of people have this cartoon villain version of Stalin, but he couldn't have pulled this off on his own, right? And so, there's absolutely nothing that they can point to, but, this is a more, more reasonable argument to make, at least. Hey, comrades. So first of all, I'm really sorry it took me so long to get back to you. I was out of town and I needed my computer to put this together. So first off, we have Walter Duranty, who headed the New York Times Moscow Bureau from 1922 all the way until 1936. He won a Pulitzer Prize for his reportings on the USSR. He openly denied the Holodomor famine. Although the term is generally credited to a Russian politician opposed to Stalin, you'll notice in American outlets Duranty is often credited for coining the term Stalinism, which he used as a pejorative. He once said, "Red Russia of today ruled by Stalinism, not communism." So no one can accuse me of one-sided sources here. Give him a Google and check out what he had to say. Then there's H.G. Wells, famous author of dozens of books including The Time Machine and The Invisible Man. He visited the USSR. He wrote about how the famine was caused largely by peasants who refused to grow without the profits they once enjoyed under capitalism. I'll put a link to the section of his book that covers this in the comments. Then we have Douglas Tottle, a union activist and union historian. He wrote a book, Fraud, Famine, and Ukrainian Fascism. In this book, he details the creation of the Holodomor myth by fascists from the Ukraine to Germany to the USA. I'll put a link to a PDF of his book in the comments. Then we have Grover Furr. He is a professor, holds a PhD, and has many books published. You can also find many of his lectures on YouTube for free. One of my favorite books he wrote, which details evidence against the Holodomor myth, is a counter-narrative to another book. You do not need to read the other book to understand or gain a great deal from Furr's book. It's called Blood Lies, the evidence that every accusation against Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union and Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands is false. It's a great book. Pick it up if you can. Then there's Why Hearst Lies About Communism. This is a great book to read in addition. Hearst owned the largest media company in the USA at the time and was rabidly anti-communist and pro-fascist. He was one of the first to begin spouting out these famine lies here in the USA. Although the book does not specifically cover the famine topic, it helps provide context for why and who these myths were spread by. All right, comrade, thank you. Do you believe Stalin intentionally starved millions of Russian citizens? No, absolutely, I do not believe that. That is a Ukrainian nationalist and German fascist myth that was spread by British papers and William Randolph Hearst in the United States through his media. Both of those papers are pro-fash, so no, I don't believe that. Do you know what I do believe, though, is that just a couple of years ago, 35 million people in the United States suffer from extreme hunger, food insecurity. And that included 9 million children. And now, just a couple of years later, that number's over 40 million people and over 10 million children. That is not propaganda. That's sad reality. It's terribly unnecessary, and the only reason that it goes on is so that a few can profit. Anything that Stalin has been accused of, the United States has basically done here or elsewhere. The whole intentional famine thing is just absurd. Give me a break. But do you have any exact facts you'd like to debate on that topic? I'd be happy to. This leaves out the Holodomor, which a lot of people believe was very much a famine that was Russian on Ukrainian, censorship. You can read the rest. The thing with Holodomor, and I have a whole bunch of videos on this, if you go back, some of them are labeled, that is an intentionally created myth. It's propaganda directed at the USSR by Ukrainian and German fash. Literally. Okay, just Google that. Google those keywords together and read a little bit about it. All right. I have some books. I doubt you want them though. Anyways, and then your next comment was then, saying like, sure, we got to talk about, American issues, but we can't leave out Russian and Ukrainian. And you're right. We have to combat the Russian-Ukrainian narrative because this is propaganda that was created by fash and then pushed by pro-fash imperialists like William Randolph Hearst here in the United States, who had a monopoly on the media at the time. And you can just Google that and you can take a little bit of look at him and his pro-fash sympathies, okay, that he put in his papers, right? And think about what was going on during that time period and why some of the pro-big business, pro-imperialist, pro-fash, the richest people at the time, the most influential and powerful people, would have been supportive of pushing an anti-USSR narrative and anti-socialist and communist propaganda. And then look at what started to come and develop off from there, with the Cold War and all these lies that they literally just made up and tossed at these countries in order to demonize them, in order to demonize socialism, so that we will not do what we need to do here in the United States to organize, agitate, and educate our fellow workers on who the real enemy is, not Russians, not Ukrainians, not Germans, Americans, okay? And that's why we keep bringing it back. It's not about whataboutism. It's about bringing it back to, like what Karl Marx says, the point of a philosopher isn't to understand the world, it's to change it. Well, I can't change Russia and Ukraine. I can't change other countries, but I live in this country and I can have some effect, albeit a very, very, little bitty one. But, hey, I'm doing what I can, right? And that's why we keep bringing up America, who has committed some of the worst atrocities in the world. Look at the agenda of the indigenous. This is it. And you have to be such a nerd sometimes to really be able to get through that propaganda, that indoctrination, that you've been taught your whole life, especially if maybe you started to become politically aware and you were just led down this wrong channel. You can end up just sucking this stuff up and just spewing it out, without a thought, without understanding any of the history of, where it comes from, why it came into existence to begin with, and why it's politically useful today. And that's the thing. People are like, why do you read so much about the USSR and, Ukraine and all of these other, countries and time periods and stuff? And I mean, we have the ability to affect the future and the present when we understand the past. And a lot of this is still being used today to demonize socialism, a weapon against the workers. So yes, there was a famine happening at that time. It was affecting more areas in the USSR and other parts of the world other than just the Ukraine. Stalin did not eat up all the grain and pay the clouds not to rain. There were a lot of other factors involved as well. When the Bolsheviks came into power, we have to remember that prior to them coming into power, there were literally food riots. Some of the cities, their stockpiles of food were literally either running out or had run out. People were rioting for food. So the situation that the Bolsheviks inherited to begin with was one of food insecurity. So, I mean, there's a lot of different factors that go into all of this. It's not really a simple, answer, especially when you try to look at sources for this stuff. You have to weed through a lot of BS to get to, not extremely anti-communist biased information. And part of the problem with that is because the Holodomor, the idea that it was man-made, was propaganda to begin with. So, of course, sources that are anti-socialist, anti-communist, anti-USSR at the time are going to begin sucking it up and spewing it out like fact. But that's how history works. And that's the beautiful part about hindsight is we can look back at it and we have the internet so we can dig past the BS propaganda. The textbooks up until, 40 years ago were teaching that George Washington's teeth were made of wood when they were indeed made of lots of things, but not wood, including, human teeth. So, but my point with that is that the textbooks, though, they taught that they were made of wood, and so the textbooks are going to tell us the imperialist papers and articles and .edus that we can find are going to come from the imperialist perspective. So, anyways. There is a great book, Fraud, Famine, and Fascism, if you can find it. I've been searching for a PDF version because for some reason, probably because Ukraine is up in the news, now for the last couple of years, people have bought this book up. So now all of a sudden it costs hundreds of dollars. You used to be able to get it for, I think, like $5, $10 from some of the presses. So anyways, if somebody has a PDF, let us know where to find it. All right. Solidarity. Yes, exactly. Great point. I mean, much of the world was suffering at that point in time in history. I mean, people want to take the USSR out of the context of the material world as a whole, the conditions of the entire world, and they want to act like, this only happened in the USSR, And many countries had food insecurity at that time, and it wasn't the only. They weren't the only country suffering from famines during this time period. And another thing that this reminds me of, when you're talking about how they didn't have, allies, and nobody's going to, help give them food aid. And some countries did. There was a little bit of aid, even some that came from the United States, ironically, but very, very, very. I mean, we're talking very, very little. Okay, not helpful. You know what I mean? Really. But this reminds me of how people criticize the USSR and Stalin for signing a non-aggression pact with Germany. When, at that time, like you're saying, no one would help them. They went around, and they went to Britain and they went to the US and they went to the West and they said, hey, funny mustache guy is gonna try to take over Europe. We might want to come together and do something about this. They hadn't yet industrialized their country. They didn't have the military capabilities to be able to take on Germany and their allies. And they knew this, the USSR. But do you know who did? The US and Britain, France, yada, yada, yada. All these other countries had militaries and had money, right? They could have helped, but they didn't want to. Instead, the US was busy funding. We have business people and associates and politicians doing all kinds of funny business with that guy, didn't we? And then you have Mussolini getting paid by the British to spread anti-socialist propaganda and to get people to go, fisticuffs with the socialists and workers in these streets. We know this. This is actual history. This is much like, the Proud Boys, today, and all of these, fash, alt-right fash that want to go out and do street fights, right, with us all. Not much difference, right? Except they're being funded, by Britain. And so, the USSR trying to get people to go and fight them, but no one will. So, I mean, what choice did they have but to sign a non-aggression pact, right? And people want to bring that up like it's some sort of gotcha. And if they looked at the context of the world and what was happening and what the USSR had just done and was about to do, they would realize how weak of a gotcha that is. But anyways, right on. Great point. Solidarity. It is idiotic, and it would be idiotic if they had been planning on staying there and starving themselves. But that wasn't the fate that they were wishing upon themselves. That's what they were putting on the rest of the country. They were actually fleeing, and they were arrested for fleeing, and they were put into gulags, prisons, just like they would be here or anywhere else. Or they were exiled. And these are the folks that everybody, cries about being in the gulags and being exiled. Do you know what else? They didn't just burn their crops. They also shot livestock. They killed their livestock so that their countrymen would starve and blame the Bolsheviks, blame the government. And then they tried to GTFO. Didn't work out well for them, did it? And their country people were starving already due to the insecurity that had been going on for a long time. I mean, when the Bolsheviks came into power, there were food riots happening prior. That's a part of the conditions that brought the revolution into being in the first place. Stalin did not pay the clouds not to rain. He did not eat all of the grain himself. And these folks did do what the prior commenter was saying, and you're just not understanding that they weren't going to stick around and starve. Of course they weren't. It was a gift they were giving to their fellow people. You come to support them for some sick reason.